Well, that's an easy parable, right? I don't mean easy like pleasant or enjoyable or good to tell your kids as a bedtime story. I mean easy like you don't need to think that hard and scratch your head too long to find out what it means. One commentary I read this week began with a single sentence explanation of who each character in the story really represents. God is the landowner, the land of Israel is the vineyard, the religious leaders are the tenants, the prophets are the ones who come to collect what is due to the landowner, and Jesus is the landowner's son who shows up in a last-ditch effort to set things right and gets killed in the process. There you go. A perfect allegory, gift-wrapped and ready to take home. Any questions? I get it. This violent and disturbing parable can be read just this way, where each character lines up neatly with some other figure. But read that way, it feels simple. It feels easy. And where is the fun in that? More importantly, where's the challenge in that? Parables are not meant to be crossword puzzles that you solve once and for all before turning the page and moving on to the next one. Parables are meant to get under your skin a little bit. They're meant to leave you wondering, to provoke discussion, to invite you into seeing something familiar in your own life in a new way. I can imagine that this story got under the skin of the religious leaders. Jesus was speaking to Pharisees and scribes in the temple in Jerusalem here, and he certainly meant to shock them into seeing their familiar lives in a new way. But if it's going to lead us into any of that kind of reflection for ourselves, then we need to see it as more than just a neat historical allegory from 2,000 years ago. We need to be open to finding ourselves somewhere in this mess of a story. And if I were going to point to where we might start looking for ourselves here, I would suggest that we start with the tenants. I realize that is not a particularly pleasant place to start. In my Bible, this section of Matthew's Gospel comes with the editorial heading, "The Wicked Tenants," and for obvious reasons. These characters are scheming and territorial and violent. They're not meant to be likable, but maybe understanding them a little bit better can help us enter into this parable more deeply. A tenant farmer, of course, is just what it sounds like. Someone who works land owned by someone else in exchange for some kind of payment, maybe a share of the crops, maybe a place to live. I hadn't thought very much about this way of life until I read William Maxwell's novel, So Long, See You Tomorrow, not long ago, which is about tenant farmers in the American Midwest about 100 years ago. In Logan County, Illinois, everyone knows who is a landowner and who is a tenant farmer. They never forget the difference. The landowners live in town in big, comfortable houses, while the tenants work the land out in the country, dressed in simple homespun clothing, with necks perpetually burnt from the sun and a permanent coating of dirt under their fingernails. The novel follows the lives of a couple families of tenant farmers, going about the difficult business of running farms, tending to crops, feeding the animals, repairing the barns and fences when something is broken. And every so often, the landowner just shows up, unannounced, to inspect how things are going on his property, or to collect his crops at the end of the season. Of course, he has a right to do this. The land legally belongs to him, after all. But to those tenants, these visits invariably feel like an intrusion. There's a painful scene where a young boy, the son of tenant farmers, watches as the landowner walks around the farm with his father, inspecting the crops and the grounds. And the boy can't stand it. This has been his home for 12 years, and he feels in a deep sense that this place belongs to him. It belongs to his family. And maybe that's how it felt to the tenant farmers in the parable when they saw the men coming down the road in their city clothes to collect the grapes The grapes that grew on vines, these farmers tended all season out in the hot sun. They're the ones who knew which vines produced well this year and which needed pruning so they'll do better next time. They are the ones with the sunburnt necks and the dirt under their fingernails. They are the ones who did the work. And maybe they're starting to feel that the place is theirs. It's not exactly right, of course. They don't own the land, and the violence they resort to is inexcusable. But can you understand how they might start to feel ownership over something that doesn't belong to them? Can you imagine how someone might make that mistake? I can. In fact, I think most of us probably have a hard time with something that the tenants have a hard time with as well. Most of us have a hard time loving without owning. That's what the tenants were asked to do, really. To care for this land without owning it. To invest themselves fully in something that wasn't theirs. And that's what we are asked to do. The Bible and the Christian faith couldn't be clearer about this. Everything belongs to God. The earth beneath our feet, the sunlight that warms our faces, the atoms that make up our bodies, the breath that fills our lungs, the people we love. None of this is ours. It belongs to God. And our task is to love without owning. And here's where I think we're really not all that far from those tenants in the parable. We can be told, just like they were, that our job is to care for something we don't possess. And we can nod, just like they did, and say we understand, and head off into the fields. And given a little bit of time, we can find ourselves grasping, just like they did, at something that was never ours to begin with. We can live as though the earth is ours, with the sole function of providing comfort for us, giving us food and water and fuel regardless of the impact we have on it, regardless of the others who depend on it. We can act as though the church is ours to direct and worry about and guard, forgetting that the church is always Christ's. We can act as though the people we care about most, partners or friends, maybe especially our children, are ours to control, demanding that they live up to our standards or conform to our expectations or behave the way we wish they would. We can act as though our lives and our gifts are ours alone to hoard and to clutch tight, rather than to offer in generosity and openness. Does this sound familiar to anyone? We have more in common with those tenants than we would like to admit, I think. Loving without owning is not as simple as it sounds. Paul had to learn this too, it seems. In our reading from his letter to the church in Philippi, he looks back on a life spent in amassing one achievement after another. This comes directly before what we heard read this morning. If anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more, he says. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. This may not sound like a killer CV to you, but to someone in Paul's community in the first century, that's exactly what it was. Paul could look at himself in the mirror and trust in all that he possessed, all that he owned, a high social status, a lifetime of accomplishments, a spotless religious record. But when he writes from prison to his beloved community in Philippi, something has changed in Paul's way of seeing things. Whatever gains I had, he says, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. Because of Christ, he's found himself loosening his grip on his life. All that stuff that he thought he owned, all the stuff he thought was his, it's all put into perspective by knowing Christ, by knowing the presence of God. In this new way of thinking, Paul's life is not about grabbing and owning, but about walking forward with an open-handed faith. Beloved, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but this one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. I wish I could tell you that learning how to love without owning was as simple as listening to a sermon about it. But I think you know as well as I do that this is a lesson most of us have to learn time and again, from one painful experience after another, one reminder after another, that our world and our communities and our families and our loved ones and even our lives are not ours to own. The promise here is that all is held in God's hands. And when we loose our grip, we find that we are actually doing what we were always meant to do. Holding on, yes, but not too tightly. Being engaged, yes, but not controlling. Loving, yes, but not possessing. If that sounds hard to you this morning, join the club. But take heart. Remember that you are not only a laborer in someone else's field, you are also a branch connected to the vine. That vine is filled with life, nourishing you and sustaining you and bearing fruit in you. It won't leave you stranded, and it won't let you go. Remember that, and see if your grip doesn't loosen just a little. Amen.